Le Canada tient en...
In 2015, Canada is holding the 42nd general election since Confederation in 1867. This election will be very different to the 41 previous elections. It will be the first fixed election date in accordance with the Election Act. 30 new seats will be added to the House of Commons, and we foresee, given the protracted election campaign, that the record high election spending limits will be unprecedented. These are but three of the most notable changes in the way the general election will be run in the foreseeable future in Canada. This election is historical. It's historic as the longest election campaign over in a century. It's the longest modern-day campaign period, without a doubt. And there are some things that voters, candidates and parties themselves will have to get used to. For example, new rules with which parties and candidates will have to familiarise themselves. Even though the new legislation was passed several months ago, no one expected before late July that the writ would be dropped so early. The Prime Minister of Canada says, "It is crucial that campaigns be financed by the parties themselves and not by taxpayers." Many pundits think instead that Stephen Harper is trying to capitalise on the financial advantage he has over other parties. In the current campaign, the spending limit is $54 million for political parties running candidates in every riding. It was $21 million in 2011. The spending limit for candidates is approximately $200,000 in 2015, whereas it was around $80,000 to $90,000 in 2011. Jean-Pierre Kingsley believes that raising the spending limits for both parties and candidates to this extent is unwarranted. One will be forgiven for thinking that all parties are subject to the same spending limit, but that's not the case. Even though they theoretically have the same spending limit, the Conservative Party is greatly advantaged. And the real problem in campaign financing is that we, the taxpayers, will wind up reimbursing the political parties to the tune of 50% of their spending. The same is true of candidates. They'll be reimbursed up to 60% of their spending. The former Chief Electoral Officer is also critical of legislation because, in his opinion, it makes voters' lives harder when it comes to identifying themselves at the polling station on election day. As far as proof of identity is concerned, what's really got in the way of voters exercising their right to vote, well, in the past, voters used to turn up at the polling station without ID, without proof of address. Another voter could vouch for them, i.e. name and address, on the proviso that they were already registered to vote at the same polling station. And an elector could only vouch for one single other person. But the government said no and put an end to that. They said, if you don't have any ID, any proof of address, bring two pieces of ID. And you can see how absurd that is. When the Conservatives introduced legislation, they argued that the practice of a carded voter vouching for his or her neighbour was seriously flawed. Quote, it sounds good in principle, and in practice it doesn't work. Elections Canada's report revealed mistakes made in a quarter of all instances of vouching. This is an unacceptable margin of error, and it opens the door to abuse of the system. The Chief Electoral Officer published a list of acceptable pieces of identification and proof of address. He ran a pilot project in a previous election so that voters could use a voter information card as proof of identity and proof of address. And it was clearly beneficial to electors, but the government said that it did not benefit electors and banned the use of the voter information card, even though the pilot project showed it to be very useful. The acceptable ID to be eligible to vote can be found on www.elections.ca. Obviously, the rationale behind IDing voters is to prevent fraud at the polling station. On the matter of unscrupulous, unsolicited robocalls, the Chief Electoral Officer reminds Canadians of the following. Elections Canada does not telephone voters. We don't have voters' telephone numbers, so we do not communicate by telephone with voters. In 2015, there was another innovation that shows just how important the internet is, or how omnipresent the internet is in our daily lives. This is the first election that we will have online voter registration. The cornerstone of any successful election is an accurate voter list. You know, there are 300,000 Canadians that move annually. That's about 8,000 Canadians a day. These voters will simply have to visit our website in order to amend their registration and update their address to ensure that they're informed when and where to vote on polling day. John, I'm just looking at the trend analysis for online registration. It's not bad at all, huh? In the space of 4 days, we have 13,000 voters who've added themselves to the list. Well, yes, look at the curve there. Yeah. Every day, registrations have gone through the roof. And you'll see here that the new registrants are mainly young Canadians and new citizens. Yes, I can see that. So by definition, these Canadians hadn't previously registered. Now, indicators point to the fact that this 18 to 25 age group is highly engaged and they're taking advantage of the online system. Canada is the second biggest country in terms of landmass. So holding a general election is challenging. Canada has a number of remote communities that are only accessible by sea or by air. But on polling day, rain, hail or shine, whether in remote areas or major metropolises, all eligible voters must exercise the right to vote if they have it. And this warehouse is one of the nerve centres for the election. All the tools needed to successfully conduct an election are or will be sent to these kinds of warehouses. There are a whole lot of logistical challenges just transporting the equipment to these communities. Sometimes it has to be done by sea or helicopter. In winter, sometimes we've had to use snowmobiles to transport the equipment. In 2015, there are 26.4 million voters, 338 ridings, 19 registered political parties, over 105,000 ballot boxes, 20,000 polling stations, and 230,000 election workers. Meeting this afternoon. Well, when you add it all up, how much does it cost in 2015 to hold an election in Canada? Well, for the upcoming election, we set a budget some time ago, which was tabled before a parliamentary committee. It was $375 million budget based on a 36-day campaign calendar. But we now know that the calendar is 78 days, so there's additional costs. Leasing of offices, you have to add a month's rent to that, so it adds up quickly. We're reviewing the figures now, but clearly it will cost more than $375 million. Well, as soon as the writ is dropped, Elections Canada puts together an electoral calendar, and important dates are set by law under the Elections Act and establishes a countdown up until polling day. We know that the deadline to throw one's hat in the ring is the 28th of September at 2 p.m. Early polling will be held from the 9th to the 12th of October, and for the first time ever, that will include a Sunday. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite Canadians to avail themselves of their right to vote. I hope that Canadians value this right, which is not available to everyone in the world, and it's an opportunity for Canadians to express their preference for the candidate that they wish to see represent them.